Welcome back to another session of Soul Sessions with Creative Mind. We've been doing a series on like a spark from fire, and we have the author with us, of course, so we get to ask her some questions.
And my book, if you could see it on my bookshelf, like A Spark from Fire, just came out last month. If you want to find out more, just a little plug, likeaspark.com to find out more.
And it's been doing well on Amazon.
We were number one a couple times in Jungian topic, and then also psychology and education. So,
awesome.
and we have some great reviews, and a lot of our students and people, fans over the years. So, like my first book, Let Love In, have read the book, and it's just a fresh take on what we teach now, which is Jungian coaching. And this episode really, I thought would be really great to talk about the ego, how to tame the ego and get unstuck in life. Because I always say that the only problem we have in life, we think we have all these problems. We don't have enough money. We don't have great relationships. We have poor health. The only problem we really truly have is that we believe we're the ego. And if we can really believe that we're not the ego and that there's something bigger and greater in us, then our life would change. And that's what the book's about, like a spark from fire, that you have that spark within you and the ego just covers it up, and that spark is your true potential. So why don't we start with what is the ego?
Yeah, so what is the ego?
What is the ego?
And I think it's worth kind of talking a little bit about the topic we left off on the last session, which was this non-dual philosophy. So the non-dual philosophy says that we're not actually in a material universe, we're in a consciousness universe, that it's made out of mind stuff. It's more like the universe is not a big clock or a big machine, it's more like a big thought, like the divine.
Big idea.
Yeah, it's a big idea. And so when we look at it from that perspective, then it makes more sense. So the way
So it's more fluid and less solid than we think it is.
Absolutely.
But it appears solid.
It appears solid. And when you believe it's solid, it creates that solidness for you. So a lot of people ask, well, why aren't we observing that fluidity of our thoughts being able to manifest things or to create things? Because you don't believe it at the heart of it. You bought into the materialistic perspective. It's called the materialistic paradigm. It's what science uses. So most people were brought up and educated in that paradigm that we are in a material universe. Mind is this abstract thing that we can't really see and measure.
It comes out of our brain and our body, and we have this mind, and it's separate from the world. It's like it could maybe send electronic pulses out to the world and bring material things back, but that's actually not how it works. It's a more mechanical. It's describing how we experience it. It appears to us, but it's not how it actually works.
Yes, and it's the paradigm that current neuroscience uses in the study of the brain. Because for neuroscience, the brain is the mind. It is the seat of consciousness. For the Eastern wisdom tradition, especially the Upanishads, consciousness is not contained in the brain. The mind, body, everything we experience, the observable universe arises from pure consciousness.
And if you think about the early days of science, the old idea was that the sun revolved around the earth. And the earth was the center of the universe, and that was science back then. And then when we these wonderful scientists came in and said, wait a minute, I think I have another idea, that actually the sun, we revolve around the sun. It was like blasphemy. And so if that can change, and we've all now accepted that, what would be possible for us as human beings to say, okay, science has created all these rules and ideas about what we're experiencing, but now with quantum physics, they're starting to question this idea of materialism. So science isn't something that is that's scientific proof. it's a scientific theory, and science keeps evolving as we evolve. We start to see a new reality, and these are the things that the monks from Vedanta and ancient thousands of years ago already knew, and now science is guess what, we have this idea of quantum physics, and the monks are like, our people have known this for thousands of years. So it's interesting how we experience something, and we think it's true because we experience it.
Yeah.
And then that's the kind of the illusion that we're under.
Yeah, and so for us, we needed a bridge between those two worlds, those two paradigms, very distinct paradigms, neuroscience in the West and Eastern wisdom tradition in the East. And the bridge for us is Jungian psychology. The Jungian model essentially encompasses both worlds, and he did that very well. And that's why we're still talking about him today. And as people become more and more interested in really finding out what is consciousness, his work becomes more and more relevant.
So ego can be described as conditioned consciousness.
Yes.
It's it's like consciousness is unlimited, and then it collapses into name and form, and then it becomes conditioned. And then we think that's all we are, and all the limitations and all those assumptions we start to see out of that filter. So the ego is this sense of I, because when we're born into a body, we can't be like, ooh, we're connected to everything. I mean, I guess when you're a baby, it kind of feels that way. You're connected to everything. And then slowly the world tells you, no, you have to be careful. And, you need food and you need nurturing and all these things to survive. And so then we forget our limitless nature, and we start to think in that materialistic paradigm because our experience is telling us, our senses are telling us, there's a me and there's a you and there's these things out there and the world out there, and we have to navigate and survive in this world. And so we just kind of, I call it spiritual, we have spiritual amnesia. We forget our true nature.
Yeah, that's the big picture. And then Jung really defined the ego as the center of our conscious mind. Mm-hmm. Now, our conscious mind, the term is to distinguish the conscious mind, our conscious everyday awareness, from the unconscious mind. So for Jung, there was this bigger, the main part of the mind was that iceberg model, that we're seeing the very tip of the iceberg, but most of the body of the iceberg is submerged in the unconscious. So we can't see it. And most of the work is going on unconsciously. So when you think about that tip, which is our current everyday awareness, he says the ego is the center of it. It is the central point where we feel that I, like that you mentioned, that sense of I. And
so the ego creates this, when we have a body, we have to protect it. So we believe we're the body, and then the mind is connected to the body. And then we think that our existence is connected to this body. And we all have that fear of what happens after we die. Is there a spiritual sense? We can't see it. All we know is what we can pick up with our senses. So we tend to kind of prune away all this possibility and limit our experience in life based to what we can see, touch, smell, taste, and things that make sense to this rational mind. And in a way, it's a gift to have this body and the separateness, because it's the opposite of that limitlessness. And so you have kind of an experience of what it would be to forget. But if we stay stuck there, we never can experience the wholeness of who we are. So Jung believed that in the beginning part of life that we build up this ego. We have an identity, we create a persona, we get a job, we fall in love, we, get good grades, get our degrees and our little certifications, and just maybe write books, like I wrote a book, or create a movie, or become a star. And then we think, okay, that's who we are. We're this character that is alive in the world in this body. But it is an illusion, because we start to believe that we're the character, and then because we believe it, then we have to defend it. then we have to protect it. And we feel like, how are we going to fit in with all the other characters? And so we create all these almost like neurotic ways of being to stay in this survival mode in the world, getting people to like us, making money so we can have a nice home and have delicious food and sex and all the things that the senses will give us to fulfill ourselves.
This is a family show.
Okay. But you know what I'm saying? Like there's all the sensual things that we feel in life. And then ultimately, all we're really doing, if we really look at it, is the ego's looking for pleasure. It's looking for pleasure and safety. And sometimes that doesn't mean growth. Sometimes that doesn't mean bliss. It's like a temporary relief from pain.
Yes. One more element that's important to understand about the ego is that it's a function, more like a process, more like an activity of the mind instead of a solid component of it.
Well, if you think about, you go to sleep at night, you have this like solid ego feels very like real. Then you go to sleep and you kind of have these like extraordinary experiences, but you still have this sense of I'm dreaming. But then there's a part where you don't remember you were self-aware. It's that deep sleep. So the ego kind of goes back into, nothingness or everythingness, but we don't remember. And then as we slowly come back to life and we wake up in the morning, it's like the ego starts to regenerate itself again. It starts to, I'm in this body. And so this happens every night. So if we can let go of our ego every night, what can we do in our waking life? How can we not let go of it, but how can we see beyond it? And how can we be self-aware in that deep sleep state? How can we make that deep sleep state aware without being with a sense of I?
Yeah, which brings us to the next question. Should we ignore or get rid of the ego?
I say no, because it's like you cannot know something until you know its opposite. So we don't want to get rid of the ego because it actually does a lot of great things. I mean, if we want to have a human experience, we need an ego. We need a part of us that's going to pull us back if a car's in the street whizzing by, that we're not going to get hurt, pulling us back if we're standing too close to a ledge, avoiding danger, having social experiences and all the things, like I said, of life, enjoying the fruits of life. We need it because the ego runs our senses and our emotions. A lot of people think that the emotions are really this kind of a higher information, but it's really the ego conditioning. So the thoughts and feelings and emotions are really about the ego, and we need that because we want to kind of see who we are, and then we could see who we're not, and that's really where that growth comes in. It's like that tension between the two helps us really understand. Because if we were all bliss, it would be hard to, like we're in deep sleep, do we know? But having that joint of awake and that deep sleep, higher bliss together at once, wow, that's an amazing.
Yeah, I think a lot of the misconception of trying to get rid of the ego and trying to kill the ego and all that comes from the fact that
it's the saboteur
let's say in doing a spiritual practice, the main pushback comes from the ego, right? Because it's conditioned. It's essentially conditioned to keep you in safety. And so anytime you try to move beyond that, there's resistance. And you come upon the ego defenses trying to protect itself.
Well, think about it. If you were going to design a game, would you design a game that you won 100% all the time? No, you would design a game when you were a kid. You always had like things that you set up as obstacles, and you went through, created a little obstacle course as a kid because it's more fun. And so you think about those obstacles in our life we're placed there by us so we can know who we're not and know who we are. And it's that tension that builds that self-awareness if we didn't have the opposite. And that's why we have other people that cause us difficulties in our life or difficult situations, so we can find out how to use them. In every hero's story in movies and books you read, the hero always has to overcome adversity. And in that adversity, he creates or she creates a new identity. And so the ego serves that purpose.
So if the aim is not to get rid of the ego, how do we coexist with it?
You know what I love that you say all the time, which is really profound, Robert, is that you just want to understand its nature. There's this story of a monk who sees a scorpion, really just drowning in the water. Do you know this story?
No.
And the person tries to save the scorpion, and I'll save you as long as you don't sting me. And he saves the scorpion, but then the scorpion stung him. And he said, "Why did you do that?" And he said, "It's my nature." And so it's like the ego's not trying to hurt you. It's going to act out of its nature. And so it's that dropping the judgment. And I think the harshest judge we have is the judgment of ourselves. And when we act out our conditioning, we have no free will. We have no control when we're triggered by people, or how we respond to people, how mistakes we've made, people we've hurt even, not intentionally, and sometimes intentionally at the moment. We lash back in anger. To be gentle with ourselves and say, "Oh, that's my ego. It's not who I really am. That's the nature of that conditioned mind." And then all of a sudden, there's this other part that can now come through. But if you're in the ego, it's like saving a drowning person. You're trying to save the drowning person. They take you down with it. You're trying to fix the ego all the time. So what you want to do is you want to know its nature without judgment. And when you start trying to fix the ego, then you can focus on the other parts of yourself that are unlimited. But a lot of people, and I know for me, that's why I wrote the book, because I spent so much time trying to fix my ego that it was just rearranging the furniture. And so we don't want to build up the ego and fix the ego. We've done that already in our life. There's lots of defenses naturally that happen. How do we step out into the world and understand the ego and then create outside of it?
Yeah, and
that's the question, right?
Yes, and for an East-West psychology, I think that's important, because a lot of the Eastern models were developed for monkhood, for living in a monastery, essentially, away from the world, renouncing the world.
Yeah, the materialism of the world.
Yes, and most of us, we're not going to do that. We're not going to leave our lives and
our careers
and run off to Tibet.
Although some people, like the Eat, Pray, Love lady did, and then she came back to the real world again.
That's not a real renunciation of the world. It's a temporary retreat, which is fine. Everything works, but the idea that we have to live in this modern world with computers and jet planes and viruses and all the
wars,
all the stresses of life, but at the same time remember our true nature, reconnect with what Jung calls the soul or the collective unconscious. Then we have to find that balance.
Well, what comes to mind is I remember when I was first starting my spiritual journey, I used my spiritual growth or my time to escape from the world. I didn't know how to integrate the two of them. I was like, I want to go and just be all spiritual, and I want to escape. And a lot of people use spirituality as an escapism and reject money and I'm giving up relationships. I'm just going to focus on my spiritual life. But it's actually the integration of both, is having the spiritual and material, Shakti and Shiva, as they say in yoga philosophy, is that you really get to have both. You get to live both ways consciously. And the difference is, some people, they compartmentalize that spirituality. They compartmentalize their healing, and it never really integrates. And Jung really was all about integration. It wasn't about getting rid of the negative parts of yourself. It's about loving those parts of yourself, integrating, saying, you know what, I know I have an ego. I'm human. I'm going to have these feelings, and it's okay. And then also it gives us permission to, or gives us, that feeling we can let go. Let's start judging other people, because everyone's fighting the same battle. We're all locked in our conditioned consciousness and waiting to it's like lifting a veil to see who we really are and see the world as it really is.
There's something liberating about understanding that we are playing at being a persona, as Jung says.
It's a character.
Yeah, the persona, the term comes from the Greek theater. The actors would wear a persona, which is a mask, so that people could, from far away, could identify them as the role they were playing. And he says that's essentially what we're doing. The ego creates a persona for us, and we act in that persona, and we start to over-identify with it. So that's where you mentioned that the only problem we have is that we think we're an ego, is that we start to believe the role that we're playing, almost like an actor forgetting that they're playing a role and getting so much into the part that they forget it's simply a role. It's a play. It's a theater piece.
There's a famous story about another story. That's a good metaphor. And most of you have heard this before, but it kind of is aligned with what we're talking about, is that a tiger got lost, a baby tiger got lost from his mother and went off and got mixed in with some sheep. And so the sheep took him in and as a baby and took care of him. And he just didn't eat them, which is his natural tendency. And he just kind of went in with the sheep. And then all of a sudden, one of his friend tigers goes by, and he's about to pounce on the sheep, and he sees his friend there hanging out with the sheep and going ba ba, and he's like, "What are you doing?" And he said, "I'm a sheep." He's like, "No, you're a tiger." And he's like, "No, I'm a sheep." And he brought him over to the water and said, "Look in the mirror, look in the reflection." And he's like, "I'm a tiger." And then he was like, "That's not," and he was like, "Oh my God, I didn't realize." So that's what happens. We get into life, we're put in with the sheep of what everyone thinks is real, and we buy into this kind of narrative that we all believe is that we're human beings and we're separate and we're not divine. And then we need someone to show us and reflect our true nature. And that's, it's an old story. You probably heard it a million times, but it kind of brings this point, is that there's nothing wrong with his buying with the sheep, but it's like not really living up to its potential, where he can go. There's another version of a eagle hanging out with the chickens, the same thing. Like if you're going to hang out with when you can fly like an eagle, why hang out with the chickens, kind of thing.
Isn't that the story of the Lion King as well?
And the Lion King, the Lion King. There's a lot of stories. I mean, if you think about even Hercules didn't know he was the son of a god. He was kind of taken away as a baby, stolen and raised by farmers, and he didn't know he was a god. And so it's like we all have those stories and those myths that we forgot our true nature. And it's not arrogant to think that you are divine, and it's actually arrogant to think you're not, and think that your ego can do it all. And so one of the concepts in the book that I talk about, which is the Jungian concept of the shadow, where when you have an ego and a persona in the world, what happens to those other parts of your human personality that you inherited from your DNA and generation of generation and generation, like how many thousands of family lines going back that's in you, tendencies and human personality traits. What do you do with those? Well, it goes into what Jung called the shadow. And we start splitting ourselves from who I think I am and who I'm not. And what's really interesting is because the ego all thinks that altruistic, like I'm such a good person, I'm a good ego, and those people are bad. It's like, it sounds nice to be a good person, but the shadow really makes us fear the judgment of being a bad person. So then how does that limit our life? We start to conform and create this conditioning that we can only be good. We have to fall in line. And how limiting is that in the world? That's why most people work for a company. They don't start their own business. Most people stay in a relationship for years and years and years, even if they're not satisfied, settle for less money, struggle because they think this is the reality and I don't have a choice. And also, if I go for something outside of my comfort zone, something terrible is going to happen to me, or I'm going to lose, I'm going to be shamed or something, I'm going to fail. And so the ego can be an enemy in that way. It kind of locks us into that pattern, but it also we have to examine it and understand it so we understand how we can set ourselves free. We can't just say, okay, ego, forget it, and I'm just going to be unlimited, because you have to really come to terms with what's the ego, and the shadow is unconscious.
Yeah.
That's the key. You can't just say, oh, well, I know I don't want to be that. There's something unconscious that's keeping that pattern in place.
Yeah. And a lot of people fear the ego. The shadow, because people talk about it in the worst possible terms, of course, that it is the dark side and the evil side and all the
negative beliefs.
Jung did write about the shadow as being potentially that, but he was talking, of course, about people that are
like
have
Hitler.
serious mental problems,
Yeah.
and so their shadow becomes a really kind of something to really contend with. Now, at the same time, he's also emphasizing that it's not an easy thing to face the shadow, because it poses a moral question for us. That idea, right, of developing our persona based on what our family is teaching us, what our culture is teaching us about good and bad, right and wrong. And so when we want to integrate the shadow, we have to face all those questions. Can I really drop that conditioning about good and bad and right and wrong that is at the heart of my moral understanding of life?
Well, here's a good question. One of the we have our training with our coaches, and someone asked, and we get this question a lot, like bigots, people that are racist and stuff like that. Like, how is that my shadow? And I said, well, it doesn't mean that you are that. But there's something that fears you about a person with that kind of quality. And we have to look deeper in that. So if those people trigger you, it's like, what is it about them? They maybe say what they want without filter. They're judgmental, they're uncaring and mean. And then you look at it and say, well, yeah, I don't want to be that way. I don't want to be like them. But how does that limit your life? Not that you go and be a bigot, but how do I not express my full self because I'm afraid of saying the wrong thing or being mean or in hurting someone, so let me just kind of live in this mediocre life, where you're not getting too much attention. You're not disappeared, you're not hiding, but you're not getting too much attention. And the ego tends to want to stay like with the lowest common denominator, like let's just stay in the group, stay in the tribe for survival. Don't make too much, take too much attention. Don't trigger people. And so it's very helpful to see the type of people that trigger us, because it's showing us where we're limited. Yeah. And it's not who we are, but it's who our ego is defending against.
Very much so.
Very not like, oh, everyone you see that triggers you is you. They're reflecting that defensiveness or that kind of conditioning. They could tell you a lot about what you can't see of the choices you're making in your life that you're not even aware of, that are driving your results.
Yeah. Somebody asked the other day, like, what are the parallels in Eastern philosophy or other spiritual traditions to the individuation process, meaning that process of integrating the shadow? And the way I see it is that all the spiritual practices were essentially about individuation, about facing and integrating the unconscious mind. Jung simply wanted to create a psychology, something that fit into the modern world that people could use, and instead of rejecting all that work that humanity did to keep those processes alive, and simply rejecting those because they're not scientific or that we can't measure them or quantify them. His idea was that would be a shame. That would be a loss of a great tradition of humanity that is needed, because in essence, we're all spiritual beings, whether we like it or not, whether we acknowledge it or not. Our true essence is that pure consciousness, that pure awareness. The Upanishads say, you are the infinite consciousness. Very clearly, very upfront. It's not a hidden process. It simply says your task is to find your way out of that labyrinth of conditioning, which is the ego.
So if you think about what the Eastern philosophy, this idea of pure awareness, is that who we really are, the self, which doesn't have any name and form. It's just a witness to, we all have that personal pure awareness in us right now. You can be aware right now that you're listening to us or watching us, that part of you that's aware, and then there's another part of your mind that's analyzing and thinking, and it's going to think after this and wrestle with these ideas, and that's the ego. So the part of yourself that's moving and changing, all your emotions, everything in your body, all the feelings you have, even disease and illness, all that's on the ego level. It's very ego level. It's conditioned experience. Some of it's genetically like we get in, our ego kind of gets a template from our genes, it gets a template from our early life experience, and then we kind of get this fixed sense of who we are. And so we have to go beyond just like healing our body, healing our emotions. We have to go to beyond the ego and say, oh, I'm not the ego. It's just faster than actually spending so much time. I call it rearranging the furniture, where you're just making all your negative thoughts positive, or your feelings, negative feelings positive, because you're just fixing the ego. And since the ego is not real and it arises temporarily and it's conditioned, it's going to bring back the same thing. So you may be reconditioning it to make it a little better, but it's almost like a game of whack-a-mole, where you're just kind of like, it's never, ever done. And I think a lot of what we hear a lot when people come to us is like, I'm so exhausted from personal growth. And it's like, it shouldn't exhaust you. It should exhilarate you. If you're exhausted, you're trying to build up your ego. You're still in that ego building. And for some people, who've had like deep issues, like therapy is really good at building up the ego, getting you that stronger sense of self. There's nothing wrong with that. But individuation is like, okay, I'm ready for the next level. I'm ready to transcend this ego, this surface identity, and really know who I really am. And sometimes it comes in the form of you making a decision, and other times events in life show up to kind of push you along. Getting laid off from a job, ending a relationship, an illness. All of a sudden, people start to say, well, what is this about? Life, it kind of stirs up your life enough for you to ask those deeper questions and get you out of that kind of limited way and having the blinders on of just going through life and thinking, well, if I just get that next raise, or if I just find that partner, everything's going to be fine. And then you get to the end of your life and you're saying, well, I've chased this illusion all my life, and you really, the answer has always been within you. That awareness, like you had said, that if people would realize that there's nothing to fix, that the awareness is already there. You just have to realize that you're not. And the ego gives us a great opportunity to see who we're not, so we can see who we are.
Incredible concepts.
Yes. And then just one more thing about, do you want to talk about just free will and what's possible after we face our shadow?
Absolutely. So you don't really have free will unless you integrate the shadow, because conditioning precisely means that you're acting, you're compelled to act by your past experiences. Your experiences in the past condition your mind, your ego, to respond to life in a certain way, to conceptualize yourself in a certain way. Your self-image derives from those experiences, as well as how you see the world, what possibilities you see in the world. So that's not free will, because you're simply kind of going by what the sum of your past experiences. The totality of your past experiences determine how you respond to the present moment. Real free will would mean that you're free to choose in the moment based on infinite possibilities.
And I think that's the key, is because we identify with what's possible through our past experience and our identity. Like, oh, I can't do that. I don't have that degree, or I can't do that because I'm not strong enough, or I can't do that, I'm too shy, or, your personality type is who you are, your astrology sign. None of that is who you really are. It's just your pattern, and to understand that we're more than that gives us birth to free will. And the tricky thing about the ego and conditioned consciousness is that we will experience our life as we believe. So if we believe that we are, this, whatever our chart says, or what our past says, what our therapist tells us, a diagnosis we get, if we believe that's who we are and what's limiting, that's what's going to be in our experience. And what we want to do is we want to go from believing, as Jung says, to knowing. And that knowing is knowing who you are. Not I believe in myself, I know myself. It's a leap. And it's a leap of only you can experience by wrestling with your ego and getting that direct experience of what's beyond it. And it's like with that wrestling, you see both sides. And then all of a sudden you're seeing, there's a third thing that arises when you're watching this battle between who you want to be in the shadow. It starts to birth something new. And Jung called that the transcendent function, where we transcend the ego, we go beyond it. And there's like, we don't let it go. It's like we use the two opposites to create something new. And then we're free, which is really empowering.
And that's the aim of individuation, as Jung defined it, is to be free, and which is also the aim of Eastern philosophy. The wisdom traditions was essentially to have you realize that you are free because you are the pure awareness, that infinite consciousness. And
I think that the beauty of coaching is that we don't label people, we don't diagnose, so. The person is free. Like we see our clients and we train our coaches to see our clients with their full potential. That this is a potential-based being in front of me right now. I don't care what happened to I don't care, but it doesn't matter what happened to you. You're free to become who you can become, who you imagine yourself to become, and like creating that imagination and cultivating that for a person versus just trying to rearrange the furniture your whole life is much more exciting journey. So that's how to tame your ego, is to basically understand it and see its nature. And that's how we get unstuck, because I think a lot of times we feel stuck because we're trying to fix the ego. We're trying to get away from, and we're believing that something out there has power to give us happiness or security. And we're just chasing ourselves in fear instead of creating ourselves from possibility.
Do we know what we're talking about next session?
Yes, we are talking about your favorite subject is how to escape your mother's shadow.
Oh.
And in my book, I talk about, it's really for women, but if you're a man, I'm sure you'll get something out of it.
Well, I think we have mothers as well.
Yeah. But I mean, I talk about that a woman is really highly influenced by her mother, because the feminine role, and that's part of our ego. If we identify as a woman, we're going to identify either accept or reject it. And even if you're not transgender or gay or not the traditional woman, that you can really see that your mother's influence, like the way she judged you, the way she accepted you, what you didn't like about her, what you did like about her, all influences our life. You can't get rid of your mother. Basically, she's going to influence you. And how do we come to terms with the shadow that our mother has created for us, that we kind of built based on her, and how do we?
You're blaming the poor mothers.
No, it's not the mother's fault.
Just kidding.
Well, here, okay, we won't get into it, but Jung says that we have, we're born with a mother archetype, and this divine woman that we project onto our mother, that she's supposed to be doing all these great things. It's what we felt, what we decided that she was short on. It might not even be true. She could have been working 3 jobs, and the child is like, I'm ignored, but the mother's like doing all these things. So our personal reality is always never what the actual reality is. And so that's really what we're going to talk about.
Excellent.
So anyway, have a wonderful rest of your day. The spring is coming. I'm so excited for the spring.
Yeah.
And if you want to find out more about my book, likeaspark.com. And we'll see you next week on Soul Sessions.
Stay well.
Take care. Bye-bye.